Good morning. And it is a good morning. Beautiful, clear, and crisp here on the Provo campus of Brigham Young University. I'm Grant Underwood, the Richard L. Evans Chair of Religious Understanding. And it's my pleasure to host the events of this day. And along with our many campus co-sponsors, to welcome all of you to what promises to be a most interesting, illuminating, and inspiring time together. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our honored guest, Professor Willie James Jennings of Yale University, whom I'll be introducing shortly. But first, a word of thanks and a word of prayer. Thanks to all the co-sponsors. If you've seen the publicity for this event, you've noticed that there are numerous campus co-sponsors, and I'd like the audience to know that they were all eager to participate and support this important event. Thanks also to the Richard L. Evans Foundation for its financial support for nearly 50 years of outstanding lectures like this one will be. And thanks also to my friend and collaborator, Adam Hellawell, who has invested many, many hours in attending to every detail from poster design to managing our webinar this morning. He's the executive assistant to the deans of the College of Religious Education. And thanks to all of you, the audience, for taking time to listen this morning in the midst of a busy time of year. It says something about your commitment to important causes at a particularly important time in American life. It is entirely fitting that we follow our normal custom here and have a word of prayer. We've asked Anthony Bates to offer that prayer. Anthony is the director of the BYU Student Connection and Leadership Center, which oversees many of the student entities on campus, including the BYU SA. And perhaps most relevant to our event today, Anthony was one of the founders of BYU's African American Civil Rights Seminar. We'll now have Anthony offer the opening prayer.
Our kind and gracious Father in heaven, we are incredibly grateful for the opportunity that we have to gather this morning. We are grateful that in the midst of a global pandemic that we have the technology and the capability to gather so many of us together for such an important discussion. We ask that thy Spirit will be with Dr. Jennings as he imparts his experience and knowledge with us, that he might be might feel emboldened and might feel encouraged and supported in his efforts to enlighten our understanding and to help us in our individual quest to improve the world and the society of which we are a part. And we ask a special blessing to be upon each and every participant here, that we might listen with open minds and open hearts, and more importantly, that we might have the courage and the capacity to act on those impressions and feelings and urges that we get to strive to create a more just and profitable society for all, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. We are truly grateful for our faith, which brings us together, and pray that we might be the means of inviting more discussion based on common ground and based on mutual interest in creating a more just and equitable society. And these blessings we ask for and do so in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Anthony. We're going to leave that picture of Anthony and especially of the church behind him on for a moment. I'm going to use that as a segue to introduce Professor Jennings. Many of you who are listening are students, and we're so delighted to have you on board. You may not be familiar with this building. This is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now it's the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. And if you'll indulge a history professor in 30-second history lesson here, this important church is the church where Martin Luther King Jr., his first and only pastorate, he became pastor in 1954 and pastored until 1960 there in Montgomery, Alabama. Incredibly historic, on the National Register of Historic Places. And here you see one of our BYU civil rights seminar groups there. One of the things that impresses me about the Dexter Baptist Church is one of its logos or favorite scriptures is Ephesians 2:10, that says, "We are the workmanship of God, who hath created us unto good works, and enabled us from before time to do them." That, I think, is a perfect description of what Martin Luther King and so many in that environment did historically, and what folks like Professor William James Jennings continue to do today, good works. Yes, Professor Jennings is a professor and an accomplished professor and scholar. Many of you, we've sent and shared the biography, you've seen it. I won't give all the details of his multi-page CV, but he has written a number of very significant books, significant because each and every one of them has won an award. The one we're talking about today, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, not only won the top prize from the American Academy of Religion, but also the Grawemeyer Prize, the leading prize in kind of religious endeavors. It's the grand prize, so to speak. And that's typical of his scholarship. I think of several words that begin with P when I think of Professor Jennings. I'm going to begin, when I think of his scholarship, it's probing and it's profound. If you've had a chance, and some of you have, and some of you will, to read his book, it's a treat to see how he probes and goes beneath the surface and does so in a clear and insightful fashion. Along with his books, of course, he's written numerous, dozens and dozens of essays and articles. But he's not only a kind of typical scholar writing to scholars, he's also one who is out among the people. He does this in a variety of capacities. He's speaking to universities. He is speaking to community groups. It doesn't matter where the venue happens to be. He is willing to go and speak because for him, this is not simply a vocation. It is, and the second word I would use, it is a passion. And this passion is apparent in all frames and formats. You can see it if you wish. In addition to today, you can look him up on YouTube. He's all over YouTube. He has thousands of viewers. This is a man who has a national impact, and we are very fortunate to have him and hear him today. And that passion comes out also because he is an ordained minister, an ordained Baptist minister, as was Dr. Martin Luther King. And also, the final P word that I would give is personable. It has been my great pleasure in the past few months to interact, and he has been so pleasant, warm, and personable that he has enabled and given me the opportunity to feel like I'm his friend. And I believe that by the conclusion of his lecture, you too will feel that warmth and his friendship. And so, Professor Willie James Jennings, who is probing, profound, passionate, and personable, we welcome you to speak to our community. Professor Jennings.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. Thank you for that very kind and very gracious introduction. Dear friends, it is a joy, a great joy, and it is an honor for me to be able to address you today. I want to thank Dr. Underwood and all the sectors of the campus that made possible this wonderful invitation. I look forward to the time when we might be together in the flesh and possibly share a meal or more. Today, I want to explore with you the themes of my book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. In this book, there is one fundamental question that drives the argument of the Christian imagination, and that is simply this: why has the communal reality of the Christian faith failed so profoundly in imagining and enacting a form of belonging more powerful and more decisive than all other forms of belonging, especially racial belonging? Why has the communal reality of the Christian faith failed so profoundly in imagining and enacting a powerful form of belonging? This question has been with me for the entire span of my intellectual life. It began forming in the place I was raised, a good place, a good city with good people. It was a place, my friends, deeply Christian, but also deeply racist. It seemed to me that the structural racism was somehow bound to the structure of the Christianity I was being presented. There was something in the Christian reality that I was living that called forth the racial reality I was living. There was something in the racial reasoning and the racial vision of the world that I saw everyone enacting that also enacted a Christian logic. Growing up in my town, I could not name what I was sensing, but I could sense that something was wrong. Something was sick, diseased. How I came to see this as a sickness and not the natural condition, the intended condition of Christians and the Christian life, is in some ways part of the mystery of the Spirit's working. I sensed, thank God, I sensed contradiction. I sensed resistance precisely through the enormous amounts of energy being expended by so many people to maintain the racial order of things: segregated Sabbaths, separated societies, and a segregated social vision of life that required constant educational efforts to sustain it. In the Christian imagination, I explore the anatomy of the diseased social imagination of Christians, and I offer tentatively a way toward healing and health. So, in my lecture today, I want to outline that anatomy, the anatomy of the diseased social imagination of Christianity as it now exists in the Western world, but also outline, again, once more tentatively, a way toward healing and health. Through the three movements of thought presented in the book, I will present our current dilemma, but also the possibilities, my friends, of a different way of life. Those movements in the book are displacement, translation, and intimacy. Displacement, translation, and intimacy, each following the other. We begin with displacement. The idea of displacement comes first because that word captures so much that is fundamental to the tragedy lodged in modern Christianity. The idea of displacement should be thought of in three ways. To displace people, to displace a story, and then to naturalize and normalize that displacement. To displace people, to displace a people, to displace a story, and then to naturalize and normalize that displacement. It is the African diaspora experience of enslavement that centers the problem of displacement. Sub-Saharan African peoples were displaced, and that displacement was justified and organized by the use of Christian theological sensibilities that were focused through greed and the opportunity to control. Now, let me be clear. Christians did not create the early modern slave trade, but Christians did offer one of the most elegant justifications for it. And at the heart of those elegant justifications were two Christian doctrines, crucial to the shaping of a Christian vision of the world. They are the doctrines of providence and the doctrine of creation, the doctrines of providence and creation. And with creation specifically, God's claim on all of creation. In short, these two doctrines applied to the opportunities afforded by slavery and entering into new lands meant that the church in the old world of what we would later call Europe saw itself doing God's work in the world through slavery and the appropriation of lands. These Christians argue that in God's providence, God is leading the church into new lands and presenting new peoples who may be brought through the gospel into the fold of God. Now, here, what is key is the designations for these peoples. What they called themselves and what lands they were from were inconsequential in relation to their true identities, which were sinners in need of salvation. They are God's creatures in need of God's guiding hand, the guiding hand the church can and will give. Now, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with these designations: sinner, child of God, creature of God, elect, and so forth. But this form of identity, theological identity, if you will, was being placed on people as they were being enslaved and removed from their lands. So you have an identity that transcends all other forms of identity being placed on people. At the exact same time, they are being torn from their places of living, their habitation. So this displacing of people continued as early Europeans entered the new worlds and displaced indigenous peoples. But it is the way they displaced indigenous peoples that is absolutely crucial for us. But let's keep one thing in mind here. The displacement of Africans and the displacement of indigenous peoples throughout the colonial world, we will call it, are deeply connected. So the way these early European Christian settlers, big designation, early European Christian settlers, displaced indigenous peoples involved two actions. They took their land and brought alien species to the land, and they denied and attacked the way so many different indigenous peoples understood their relation to the land. That is, how they understood who they are in relation to the land they inhabit. The indigenous peoples encountered by these Christian settlers understood their identities as bound up with the land and the animals, and the water and the sky, the landscapes and the seasons. Before they talked about possessing land, and most did not really use that exact language, they talked about being possessed, if you will, by the land. What I mean by that is that they understood themselves to be familied with the animals, and that the land and the animals spoke to them. The land and the animals were alive and communicating, sometimes speaking even through them. Their ancestors came from and returned to the land and the animals, and were yet with them through the land and the animals. Now, for the Christian settlers, this way of thinking and talking was at best primitive nonsense, and at worst demon-inspired heresy that led inextricably to idolatry, the worship of the creature and not the creator. They pressed upon indigenous peoples the idea that the land and the animals are resources for our use and enjoyment given by God, and that who we are, who you are, indigenous person, is not only separable from the land and animals, but also wholly different from them. Your identities, the Christian settlers said to the indigenous peoples, your identities you carry on your bodies without remainder. And the bodies and it is bodies that bring me to the second sense of displacement, the displacement of story. So the early Christian settlers were overwhelmed by the new worlds when they came. The vastness of the land, the wide variety of plants and animals, and the wide variety of peoples and languages. In order to try to make sense of this overwhelming diversity, these settlers and the peoples back in the old world sought to discern God's order to it all, because it had to have an order if God created it. The first step in trying to discern order is, of course, to make comparisons, especially comparisons of bodies. So they made comparisons using their own bodies as the basis of those comparisons. And when one makes comparisons, you make use of what you understand to be the true, the good, and the beautiful. So the comparisons they made drew on racial designations: white to black, white to black. White to black were not just designations. It became a way to frame designations. And this is very important. It's not just designations, it's a way to frame designations. That is, to place all people on a range from white to black, most similar to the Europeans, to most dissimilar. All people may be placed on a range from white to black. The European was at one end, white, and the African was at the other end, black. But here's what's crucial: everyone could be plotted in between. Could be plotted in between. Now, what is crucial here is that these Christian settlers and their peoples back in the old world did not consult the indigenous peoples about these designations. In fact, they ignored how indigenous peoples understood themselves and how they understood other peoples. In point of fact, they displaced the stories that indigenous peoples told about themselves. Because as far as the Christian settlers were concerned, those stories gave no real insight or knowledge about who they actually were, and no insight about the divine order of it all. Only they, the Christian settlers, were in the position to understand what God was doing in the world because they were the people of God. Which brings me to another really important displacement of story. You see, the Christians who came to the new worlds already existed inside a terrible mistake. Simply put, they believed that God had rejected Jewish people as the people of God and replaced them with Gentiles, that is, with Christians. We Christians became the people of God. Now, the technical term for this is supersessionism, which basically means to supersede or supplant something. In this case, Christians replace Jewish people as the elect, the chosen of God. Now, what that meant was that the Christian settlers who came to the new worlds and the Christians of the old world had for centuries believed that they were the center of attention for God, the center of attention for God. That the scriptures were first and foremost their scriptures, and that whatever God was doing in the world, God was doing through them. They were at the center. This was a centered existence. So the Christian settlers believed they were at the center of existence by God's will, by God's providence. And from that centered position, they would bring meaning and order and salvation and saving clarity to the world. Now, we'll return to these matters when we come to the next movement translation. But for now, the point not to be missed is the displacing of story. The displacing of the story. By displacing Israel, these Christians had displaced their own story. That is the story of Gentile inclusion. That Gentiles were included in the story of Israel. We enter a story that was not our story, but Israel's story. And there was something absolutely crucial to being Christian, to being a Christian, that is lost by this displacement. Which brings me to the third aspect of displacement, the naturalizing and normalizing of displacement. So these early European Christian settlers believed that God had brought them to the new world to do an important work, to cultivate the peoples and to cultivate the lands, to bring both people and land to maturity. What that maturity would mean for the indigenous peoples was to understand themselves just like these settlers understood themselves in the land. That is, they should understand themselves as people who project meaning onto the world and may bring the world of nature to its full and proper use. That is, to make it profitable. That's what maturity means, to make it profitable. To make it profitable required seeing the land and all that is implied by the land, access to waterways, to animals, as being able to be put into pieces, fragments, and bought and sold. Put into pieces, fragments, bought and sold. Private property. Private property. Indigenous peoples should also, like the settlers, understand themselves as carrying their identities completely on their bodies. They may call themselves as people, the people of the bear, or the people of the salmon, or the people of the caribou, or of this or that mountain, or this or that river, or this or that group body of trees. But those designations, cute as they are inconsequential to who they really are as human beings and as sinners and as people who can be designated, plotted between black and white, white and black. Now, friends, I've taken the lion's share of my time so far to stay with this first movement of displacement because I wanted to explain the origins of modern ideas of race and the origin of whiteness. Race as we understand it and live it now grows out of a contorted Christian vision that denied place-centered identity and forced people to see their identities wholly contained on their bodies, separate from any place that they live. That's really important. Race also grows out of what Christians did to the earth. Having stripped it from being essential aspects of people's identities, they turned it into private property on which they projected meaning, purpose, and value. They interpreted the land as inanimate and non-communicative. It was just dirt. It was just resource. So we are talking about displacement that forms enclosure, encasing the body in race and enclosing the land in ownership. One more time, encasing the body in race and enclosing the land in ownership. So race and private property in the modern world are two sides of the same coin. The one does not come to exist in the new worlds in its full power without the other. And whiteness, whiteness forms as the organizing center of race. Now, let me take my time so that you can follow this. Whiteness is not phenotype. It is not first appearance or biology or culture, and certainly not a part of God's creation. Whiteness forms as a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world at the same time, a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world at the same time. Whiteness is a way of organizing the world, making sense of the world. And whiteness is having the power to order one's world by that effort. So before I turn to the second movement translation, I want to highlight three things that I have said that also point to things Christians and others concerned with overcoming what I've called the racial condition might do. This is a possible way forward. First, Christians need to be introduced to their real story, the story of Gentile inclusion, the story that we entered, the story of another people, Israel. We learn through that story what it means to enter in from the outside to the inside. We learn humility, but we also learn what it means to live lives that are not at the centered. Let's call it de-centered life, as those who remember what Ephesians 2 says, the passage that Dr. Underwood mentioned earlier, what Ephesians 2 says, that we were outsiders, outside the covenants of promise, but we have been brought in by the gracious act of God. And we learn through this of how to join others. Second, we cannot address race and all the matters that surround race without thinking about private property and the ways we build communities, build environments that reinforce the closures that created and yet nurture race. Race and geography are two sides of the same coin, and we cannot address one without addressing the other. And number three, we have to challenge what we have all been taught. That place is inconsequential to who we are and how we live. You see, the quality and character of how we relate to one another is directly dependent upon the ways we understand and live the connection to the land and the peoples who call this land their home before us. We deny belief in God, our creator, and the world as creation as long as we dishonor the indigenous peoples and their claims to this land. This brings me now then to the second movement, translation. And I'll take less time with this. Translation has to do with what it means for Christians to enter the worlds of others. But here we are continuing to look at the problems created by the racial condition for Christian thought and life. Translation. The Christian settlers who entered the new worlds entered as centered selves. We mentioned this earlier. Those who believed that they were at the center of existence in God's eyes. From that position, they believed they were called by God to be the teachers of the world. They believed they were called to teach the gospel truth, the truth of the world, how the world actually worked, and how to live in the world. Now, what is key here is how they then looked at all the peoples of the world they were encountering. They saw them as students, but not just students, but perpetual students, always in need of their guidance, generation after generation. The settlers took an imperial position in relation to education. They were always in the position of the teachers and never to any real extent in the position of learners, and certainly never in the position of having any indigenous peoples as long-term teachers of settlers. This meant for the settlers their primary work among indigenous peoples of creating community, building religious communities, and educating them was from the perspective of bringing them into their European worlds. In everything that the settlers would do for or with indigenous peoples, the overarching reality and goal was to bring them into their worlds. They, the settlers, thought they had come, though they had come to the new worlds. They treated the native peoples as though they, the settlers, were at home and inviting the native peoples into their home. They saw themselves as hosts and the indigenous peoples as guests. This way of looking at native peoples and their worlds created one overarching reality that was almost inescapable for native peoples. And that reality can be captured with one word: evaluation. Evaluation. They were being brought into a comprehensive reality of European evaluation that evaluated everything about indigenous life, an evaluation born of whiteness. And they were being pressed to internalize that way of evaluating everything. That reality of evaluation not only built what was true, what was good, and what was beautiful around the European, but also sought to teach native peoples that only through the European and his ways of seeing could they discover the true, the good, and the beautiful, even in themselves. Now, this insidious reality of evaluation profoundly shaped two things. It profoundly shaped the way they translated the Bible, that is, the way Christian settlers translated the Bible, and the way they translated the social world of the Christian. You know, one of the great accomplishments of Christian missionaries was and is the translation of the Bible into indigenous languages. As my late great colleague, the late Dr. Lyman Sani, taught so powerfully, that the work of translation showed a God who loves the mother tongues of all people and chooses to be known in those languages. The translation of the Bible, he argued, was also the basis of grammars and peoples then being able to create their own literature and define for themselves a sense of personhood that prepared them, he said, to become nations in the modern sense of the idea. So having the Bible in their own language helped native peoples to become Christian people on the way to possibly becoming a Christian nation. The problem showed up in the way translation was treated. Follow me here. It was treated as though it created Christian peoples, each with their own Bible. Created Christian peoples, each with their own Bible. The effect of translation done by the settlers was that it told each people who had the Bible that they now possessed the Word of God, just like the European Christian settlers possessed the Word of God in their own language. But what about Israel? What was not translated was the story of Gentile inclusion. In the history of translation, Israel was just a historical footnote. They had the Word of God, but now we have the Word of God, and you, native people, now you have the Word of God. What is missing is the reality of entering into another people's story, and with it, the need to share in understanding and interpreting that story of God's great love, and the need to translate our lives to one another. Now, the point not to be missed here was that translation was treated as though it was intended to create Christian peoples, each with their own Bible, rather than to create a Christian people who shared in the work of translating their lives one to another. But the translation of the Bible was inside the translation of the social worlds of Native peoples. As I said earlier, indigenous peoples were being brought into European worlds even in their own lands. This meant that they were being forced into the journey of assimilation. The Christian world they were being presented, for the most part, was one that asked them to not simply adopt and adapt to a white Western world, but also to judge the quality of their Christian faith by that assimilation, and to judge the quality of their lives by it as well. Now, this is not new news, but we have not reckoned enough with the horrors created by this legacy of assimilation. On the one hand, this legacy created a relentless, derogatory vision with which many formerly colonized peoples yet struggle. We Christians created the idea of backwardness and helped so many people unleash it against their own peoples and ways of life. On the other hand, this same legacy of assimilation fostered and yet fosters constant protective gestures among peoples who believe with warrant that they must go it alone, building up their own cultures and communities in a world that aims to kill both body and soul. Now, again, allow me to highlight three things. Allow me to highlight three things that I've said that point to things Christians and all others concerned with overcoming what I've called the racial condition might be able to do. This is also a way forward. First, Christians must rethink what it means to be learners as fundamental to Christian witness. Christianity in the Western world, my friends, formed without the humility of a learner. That is, that basic posture, that basic disposition is missing from the logic of Christian witness. We have been taught to believe that God is only present in the talking and the teaching. And in this way, we never fully learn the crucial lesson of the incarnation, God becoming flesh. God becoming flesh and becoming a human being who learned before he taught. God was yet God, learning, not speaking. Second, there is a gift of reverse assimilation that we have never taken up as part of a Christian heritage. We have never learned to cherish the importance of Christians learning to adapt and adopt other people's ways of life, not as some missionary ploy or some tool for colonization, but as a call from God to expand our lives in and with the lives of others. Now, I want to be clear on this side of the history of colonialization and assimilation and racism and so forth. What I am saying to some listening to me sounds strange and even fantastical. because we have been taught that assimilation always means loss. But we serve a God who became flesh, fully human, and yet remained God. There is a form of Christian life that is possible, that enters fully into the ways of life of others, and from within that life gestures love of those specific people, and at the same time, love of God. Third, overcoming the problem of whiteness and the lure of whiteness requires we reimagine translation. As I mentioned earlier, we need to understand that whiteness is a way of life and not phenotype or biology. So many people of color have learned from the beginning of modern racial designations to distinguish who they are as people who have come to be designated as Black or Asian or South Pacific or Indian, to distinguish who they have come to be called from the derogatory vision of Blackness or Asianness or Indianness. How to tease out, to pull out the slivers and the fragments of things that are tied to who they actually are from the mass of derogatory reality that's constantly being placed, trying to be placed upon them. But if whiteness is constructed as always positive, always good, always something to be achieved, then there is never any reason to make a distinction. The collapse becomes permanent. Yet the work of translation calls on us not only to make the distinction, but to enter into new ways of being in the world with others. Which brings me then to the final movement, intimacy, and the deep problems given our diseased Christian imagination. And with this, I'll be short as my time is running from me. So intimacy has to do with how we imagine belonging and how we create space. What displacement and translation created was something called white Christianity. And what white Christianity generated were ways of imagining belonging and creating space that naturalized and normalized segregationalist mentalities. This is not just segregation, my friends, but this is coming to a way of thinking and being in the world that finds my sense of what is normal, what is safe, and what is comfortable along racial and ethnic lines. And in this way of thinking and being, we find ourselves building and imagining life concretely and geographically toward racially formed visions of what is normal, what is safe, and what is comfortable. White Christianity in this regard generated and generates an effect well beyond white controlled communities into how other peoples imagine what they understand to be normal and safe and comfortable. Now, what is crucial here is not the idea that people prefer their own people. That is not new news. What is crucial here is that this is a Christianity formed to generate those segregationalist mentalities, which is the exact opposite of the trajectory of Christian faith. The trajectory of Christian faith is to move toward creating a new sense of what is normal, what is safe, and what is comfortable in the multitude, in that beautiful and strange diversity of creatures loved by God, in the crowd of people who were enemies, but who now, because of the living God in flesh, because of Jesus, the Jewish human being, are being drawn by the Spirit of God together. White Christianity thwarts this trajectory because it formed and now lives quietly and comfortably in a form of what I call controlling intimacy. Controlling intimacy. You see, from the very beginning of modern colonialism, all non-white people, all native peoples were being forced to enter the intimate space of European lives as their servants, as their slaves, as their workers, as their lovers, as their students. And from inside that space, Europeans and their children presented their needs, their longings, their passions, their hungers as the ground on which native peoples would have to form and negotiate their own needs and longings, passions, and hungers. From within that intimate space, native peoples would be constantly told that caring for and serving the intimate emotional and physical needs of white bodies would be necessary for their own health and well-being. So this was intimate space that was controlled space and needs to sense control in order for it to feel intimate. But the intimate space being formed by the Spirit of God moves away from control, where people of color provide emotional service along these old colonial lines. What we learn from the book of Acts is that the Spirit of God is always working to join us together with those we would prefer not to be together with. So, as I close this lecture, allow me to first highlight again three things that I have said at this point, that I've said here, that point to the things Christians, and of course all others concerned with overcoming what I've called the racial condition, might do. This is also a possible way forward. And then I'll just make one very brief closing remark. First, we must all work against the segregationist mentalities that form through white Christianity. Unless we intentionally work against it, we will always build toward the logics of segregation. And those logics grow from what we think and feel as safe, normal, and comfortable. Second, whiteness always aims at control of geographic places and intimate spaces, and we must fight against that control with a serious intentionality toward real diversity. You see, whiteness always seeks to reproduce itself through geographic configurations, that is, through the built environment, through building environments that control diversity, rather than environments that are governed by diverse peoples living and working and loving together. And third, we must seek to yield to the Spirit, who is always guiding us toward those we would prefer not to be joined together with. There is, my friends, a spiritual discipline that calls to us to allow God to reshape our sense of what is safe, what is comfortable, and what is normal through a life together with those different from us. So, just one final concluding remark. So, my lecture today has clearly been aimed at Christians and Christian communities because Christianity is the womb within which the racial condition came to life. We are its parents. There is a Christian architecture to modern racial reasoning, to modern racial reality, to modern racism. And no society in the Western world can fully address the problems of race until we reckon with that Christian architecture. But clearly, you don't have to be Christian to address these matters. But my hope is that Christians might be more helpful and collaborative with those outside of Christianity who are trying to overcome our shared racial dilemma by sharing with them the wider, deeper story that we are in. And for those who are not Christian, to now know this story is to have a better sense of what might be possible. Thank you very much for listening so patiently and carefully to me. And I look forward to our conversation together.
And thank you, Professor Jennings, for a truly mesmerizing as well as substantive address. And to the audience, if this whets your appetite, this is only the beginning. We have 2 afternoon workshops today where we're going to take a deep dive into this wonderful book that Professor Jennings has written and beautifully summarized and distilled for us this morning. So if you're available, you'll see here on the screen the times, and you'll have the links there for you. I would also like to draw to your attention again that we're just at the beginning, and next Friday, we're going to have more, and we're going to have Professor Jennings discussing his fascinating volume that just came out a few months ago and has already won an award, and that is After Whiteness, an Education in Belonging. I think we all appreciate so much both his diagnosis and his vision for resolution and healing and improvement and moving forward in a significant way. So again, thank you very much, Professor Jennings. I just thought I would introduce, if they're available, 2 of our question moderators, because I want everyone to know this afternoon is your time for questions and answers. And here we see on our screen, Lita Little Giddens, who is here with us at BYU, a wonderful soul. Many of you know her that way. She's talented in her own way, a real force to be reckoned with on this campus. She manages the diversity collaboration and inclusion initiative for the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences, and is a vibrant and vital part of the university's Race, Equity, and Belonging Committee. So she'll be moderating. Along with her is Professor Matt Wickman, who many of us know, many of you may know, as a professor of English and also the founding director of the BYU Humanities Center. So these will be our moderators and helping us engage and your questions and other questions that come forward this afternoon. So if you're available, we welcome you back at noon and or at 2 o'clock, and we'll continue at that time. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you again, Professor Jennings, for a wonderful launch today.
More than welcome.